Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. Chances are that if you've ever tried drawing hands, you know how challenging it is. Just like with any other kind of anatomical drawing or portrait. In the beginning of my art journey, I remember how I shied away from drawing hands or adding hands into my figure drawings. I used to hide the person's forearms and hands behind their backs or behind other objects in the scenes so that I didn't have to draw hands and run the risk of ruining my drawing. However, there came a point in time at which I just had to take the bull by the horns and actually learn more about hands anatomically and actually challenge myself to focus on drawing hands. And this is how my hand drawings improved. And in past videos, I've shared lots and lots of my drawings that I've made of hands in different poses in sketchbooks of mine, which I'll be linking to down below in case you'd like to just get a greater idea as to how many hands I've drawn in order to get to the point that I'm currently at. But I definitely wanted to get that out there and share that with you so that you can know that you're not alone if you're struggling with drawing hands, and just know that it is a matter of learning more about the anatomical features of hands, how they bend in different ways, the locations of different things, really practicing your observation when it comes to seeing people's hands in real life and challenging yourself to put pencil to paper and draw different hands in different poses, different positions, and over time, you'll get there. I've received many questions over the years whenever I share my hand drawings related to what my method is and what are the things that I make sure to have in mind in order to arrive at believable proportions and shapes when I am sketching hands freehand. And so in today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my full process and how I use the envelope method in order to be able to arrive at a successful sketch that looks believable, that I can then move on to painting with watercolor, shading with graphite, adding detail with pen and ink, or whatever I might decide to do. The preliminary outline sketch is the base and foundation for everything that is coming up next. And if proportions and shapes, perspective, and all that doesn't look good in that preliminary outline sketch, no amount of detail, shading, or texture is going to make the piece look believable. So we want to focus on arriving at great proportions and shapes and take as long as we need to developing that preliminary outline sketch before moving on to anything else. And then once you're good with this, we can move on to studies that involve shading or using color. So starting with phase one, and this is where we start laying down our envelopes. If you've checked out any of my past drawing tutorials, and you've probably already heard me talk about this envelope process. And all it is just simplifying what you're looking at into simple shapes, a combination of simple shapes. This ability to simplify whatever you're looking at is essential when you're trying to draw pretty much anything. And just like with drawing anything else, we're also going to be focusing on largest general shapes and making our way towards specifics only after those largest general shapes have been successfully created with proper proportions, with proper locations, with proper shapes, etc. When that's good, we then move on to adding smaller details. In this case, it can be fingernails, it can be lines in the hand, etc. And last but not least, it's essential, just like when we're drawing anything else, to start drawing super lightly in the beginning so that you can easily erase mistakes and refine your drawing as you go, and so that things don't start becoming way too messy. So those are the three keys that I always remind you guys. Doesn't matter what it is that you're drawing. Those are three things you want to make sure to always do. A, simplify everything into simple shapes or combinations of simple shapes. 2, start from general and make your way towards specifics. And 3, draw light until you get it right. So with this particular hand pose, as you can see, I have broken up the hand into 1, 2, 3, 4 shapes, and then the forearm itself can be the 5th shape if you want to add it in at this point. Notice how I have grouped together the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky, and the thumb and the index finger are standing alone in separate shapes. This is something that I often do whenever two or more fingers of the hand are touching, they're right next to each other, or they're overlapping. And once these largest envelopes have been created effectively, I then break up that shape where those three fingers are into separate smaller shapes, one for each finger. So depending on the hand pose or position, we can make use of different tools like this to help facilitate the process for us for these initial envelopes. Something that I want to make sure to explain at this point is there is no right or wrong way to create your envelopes. The point of these initial shapes that you're laying down is for you to be able to decipher proportions, locations, shapes, etc. You just want to start laying down simple shapes on paper that'll help you start visualizing the different parts of the hand so that you have something to relate with each other. If you don't start laying down something on paper, you're not going to have any shapes to relate other shapes with or to. And getting proportions right is all about getting the relationships between the different parts making up the whole right. This is a great way to start getting something down on paper quick in order to start comparing lengths, widths, angles, locations, etc., which is going to help you get those proportions and those shapes right, which is so key whenever you're drawing anything that's anatomical. You can see how angular these shapes are, and this is because at this point in the process, the simpler, the better. However, as I said, there is no right or wrong way to create your envelopes. If you want to add in more angles so that the shapes look a little bit more like the actual hand, you can go ahead and do that. For me, I just like simplifying as much as possible and then refining as I go. All right, so as I said, I'm going to be creating my sketch with my B pencil, and I will be drawing a little bit darker than what I would do if I were just drawing this for myself, because I want you to be able to see what I am doing. But please make sure that you're drawing as lightly as possible. Notice how I am holding my pencil from way higher up. This enables me to move my entire arm and forearm as I am doing this, and it also helps me create lighter lines. I talk much more about different drawing pencil grips and also drills that you can do to gain better control over your drawing pencils in other videos, which I'll make sure to link to down below as well. But all I am doing here is I am getting started with the largest shape, which is in this case the shape created by the palm of the hand. And when it comes to hands, unless it is a very different hand pose where there is a lot of foreshortening going on, oftentimes it just makes sense to start with the palm of the hand, because not only is this the largest part of the hand, but also all the fingers are connected to the palm of the hand. So it just makes sense to start there. I'm constantly observing that reference photo and noticing the major angles created by the palm of the hand. And I'm just trying to recreate those same angles as best as I can. And as I am drawing this shape for the palm of the hand, I am kind of ignoring the group of overlapping fingers that are covering up part of that palm. I'm doing my best to tune that out, bringing to mind what I know to be true about hands, maybe even seeing my own hand so that I can make up for the information that I'm visually lacking in that reference photo. Noticing in my own hand that if I open up my hand, palm facing up, I see a curve where those fingers connect to the palm. And that's how I'm able to close that shape in my drawing, even though I'm not able to see that in that reference photo because those fingers are covering up that section of the palm. After that blocky shape for the palm had been added in, I started creating lines to help me start deciphering major angles for both the thumb and the index finger. And I also started creating that medium-sized envelope, which is grouping the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky together. At this point, I now have more shapes, more lines that I can start comparing that allow me to visualize the different parts of the hand. I can now compare them in terms of widths, in terms of lengths, angles created, etc., so that I can slowly but surely arrive at effective proportions before moving on to the next phase of this drawing process. The more shapes you have on paper, the more lines you lay down for yourself, the more points of comparison you're going to have. And remember that it's all about how everything fits together as a whole. If you have to add in any tick marks for yourself to make sure that things are aligned or that they are the correct size, by all means draw little tick marks for yourself or extend lines. For example, right here, you can see how I created a line before closing this shape that I am creating for the thumb. I observed that reference photo and noticed the length of that thumb and how its length would compare to the length of the finger nearest it. I noticed that the tip of that thumb would end very close to the first knuckle line in that finger nearest it. So that's where I created that guideline and then started drawing the shape of the thumb. Notice landmarks within the hand, lines created by the knuckles, tips or ends of your shapes, and where they reach each other. Does this align with this? How many times does this shape fit into this shape, etc.? That's something that can definitely help you get the lengths and even the widths of your different fingers in effectively. And also noticing the shapes created by the negative spaces in between your fingers is also incredibly powerful. Noticing the negative spaces, for example, between the thumb and the upper edge of the palm of the hand, noticing that triangular negative area and trying to replicate that in your sketch is very helpful to get those proportions and locations right. And also the negative space created between the index finger and the edge of that envelope that is grouping the other fingers together. Notice those triangular negative areas in between those shapes and try to replicate that shape created by those negative spaces. It's not just about the shapes inside of the hand, but it's also about noticing the shapes outside of the hand. Alright, so once I was happy with my initial envelopes, proportions, angles, shapes look good to me, it was time to start refining my drawing, start turning more angular, blocky shapes into curves, and also start breaking up larger shapes into medium-sized shapes. So the first thing that I did was I went in with my soft eraser and I erased out any sections of lines that I no longer needed. You probably saw me use a kitchen paper towel to sweep off those eraser bits instead of using my hand. And this is just to protect the integrity of my paper, because if I use my hand to dust off those eraser bits, I can get hand oils and maybe graphite or dirt on my paper, and I can start smudging things and making things messy or dirty. Once I had removed those lines that I no longer needed, you can see how I'm starting to break up the finger shapes into separate sections. And when it comes to drawing hands, each finger can be broken up into the sections created by the knuckles. It just makes sense. And it's very helpful to start adding in those lines at this point, because you can see if the angles that you have used for your finger shapes are making sense with how fingers bend at the knuckles. And having more lines present also gives you more guidelines, more points of comparison. And when it comes to hand proportions, fingers are broken up into thirds. The length of each section in between those knuckles, they're relatively similar, so you can make sure that things are also making sense in terms of that. Once I got those lines in for those knuckles in the index finger and the thumb, you can see how I'm starting to break up this envelope with the three fingers into three separate shapes. And I am definitely using little tick marks to make sure that the shapes end where they should end. Overlapping fingers can definitely be a challenge because you can't see certain edges. And it's very important that when shapes are overlapping on top of each other, that you make that overlapping effect or illusion happen in your drawing. So notice which finger is in front of other fingers, and notice which edges of those shapes are being covered up by a finger that is in front of it. I oftentimes see beginners struggling with things that are overlapping on top of each other. So really take a moment to observe that reference photo and notice which finger is covering up which, and make sure that the shapes that you create go hand in hand with that your shapes transmit that overlapping. After having broken up that shape into smaller shapes, I erased that unnecessary line that I had before from my initial envelope, and I am turning these angular shapes into more curved shapes. After doing that refining process, I'm starting to add in a little bit of an illusion of those lines created by the knuckles, which for these three fingers are quite difficult to see because we actually see the back part of the fingers and not the front, and also the positioning of the fingers, which have some foreshortened sections to them. Also, because those three fingers are kind of in shadow, those lines are a little bit more difficult to see. However, I still want to make sure that I at least take what I know to be true about the anatomy of hands and knuckle placement and all that to add them in, just to make sure that my fingers are bending in a believable way and that things are making sense in terms of proportions. Those lines created by the knuckles are just a great way for me to break down these finger shapes into smaller shapes and make sure that everything is looking good. If I don't place them, I'm not going to have those points of comparison in order to make sure that whatever is visible for those three different sections of those fingers looks believable in terms of its size. When it comes to getting really good at drawing hands or really anything that's anatomical, the human figure in general, a huge part of it is gaining more knowledge about its proportions, about its structure, about its features. The human body and every part of the human body is so complex, and because it has all of these separate parts that bend and are flexible in different ways, and there's an infinite amount of poses that we can come across that we might want to draw. And most likely than not, natural poses that we try to draw are going to have certain sections that are foreshortened or that are covered up by other portions of whatever it is that we're drawing. If we don't have at least a basic understanding of what we're drawing, we're not going to be able to effectively make up for that information that we're visually lacking. If you know about the structure, then you're probably going to be able to draw it much more effectively because you're going to have that knowledge of what that section that you can't see looks like, and you're going to be able to draw it in a more believable way. And so I'm going to make sure to leave a link to a book that really helped me a ton when I was trying to get better at hand drawings, and this is Drawing the Head and Hands by Andrew Loomis. This image that I am sharing right now is from his book. So I got the largest shapes in, I broke them down into medium-sized shapes, and I then broke down those medium-sized shapes into smaller shapes wherever it made sense. I'm constantly comparing my sketch with my reference photo, noticing to see if there's anything that needs to be changed, made bigger, made smaller, moved a little bit to the left or to the right, whatever the case may be. I'm probably observing my reference photo at least 50% of my entire working time. My eyes are constantly moving between my sketch and the reference photo. And you can see how I am bringing in my eraser from time to time as I'm doing my refining, and I am able to completely erase out all of the previous line work that I did with no issue because I've been making sure to draw lightly. I'm continuing to observe that reference photo and really seeing all of these small curves and shapes created by bones and also fat pads throughout the hand. Hands have lots of little bones and also a few muscles and fat pads. And something that's helpful for me when I'm drawing hands is I try to make sections where I see bones a little bit more angular in my drawing or a little bit flatter, and the sections of the hands that have curvier muscles to them or fat pads, I make sure to draw with more curves. So that's a great way to visually distinguish bone from muscle or fat. Try to bring to mind what sections of the hand have more of a concave look to them, meaning that section is sunken in, like the center of the palm of your hand, which doesn't have any muscle or fat in it. It's mostly skin and bones and veins. And which sections have more of a convex look to them, meaning it's an outwards bump because there is muscle, because there is fat, etc. And make sure that the lines that you're drawing inside of the fingers, inside of the hand, transmit whether that section is a bump or whether it's sunken in. Okay, so everything is looking pretty good, and it is time to move on to phase number 3, where we're going to be adding our fingernails and other details such as the lines in the palm of the hand. Now, for me, fingernails have always been pretty challenging. They are important to get in right because the shape that we're able to see for the fingernail in each finger is one of the key things that transmits the orientation of the finger in space. And if we don't correctly portray that orientation of that fingernail, the perspective of the entire finger that that fingernail is on is going to look off. Another thing that is challenging is that fingers can be bending in different ways. So what we're able to see for each fingernail is going to be different from finger to finger. And fingernails are one of those things that many times our brains tell us they look a certain way or they have a certain shape or whatever the case may be, but they don't actually look that way in real life. So the best thing I can kind of suggest here is really observe that reference photo closely. Notice what you're able to see of that fingernail. What shape do you see? Do you see the outside of the fingernail, or are you able to see the inside of the fingernail, or do you see both, like with the thumb here? Whenever you have any doubts or any questions, observe your own hands. Try to recreate that pose that you see in that reference photo using your own hands to better inform your drawing before you put pencil to paper. Another thing that can be challenging is that many times our brains tell us to add in the shape of the nail right in the middle of that fingertip, centered right in that shape, when they're not really in that location. They're either closer to the left edge or to the right edge, depending on the orientation of the finger, how it's folding or bending, and also our vantage point in relation to the hand, where we're seeing the finger from, our perspective in relation to the finger. Oftentimes, I like starting by placing a little tick mark where the nail bed would be, and if I'm drawing longer fingernails, like in this case, I place a second tick mark where that tip of that nail would be. And then once I have those two little tick marks in, which tell me the length of the fingernail, I then go ahead and draw the side edges closing that shape, paying attention to that shape created by the nail in the photo. See, that's what I'm doing right here. I first get started with placing the little tick mark at the bottom where the bed of the nail would be. I place the tick mark at the top where the nail basically ends, the tip of the nail, and then I close those sides of that shape. Once the shape of the nail and the location of this shape look good to me, I go ahead and take my eraser. I erase out that little line that's the tip of the finger that I don't need anymore. And I actually draw in that kind of half moon shape for the tip of the nail, where the pink part of the nail turns into the white tip of the nail. And also, if you can see in that reference photo, the other kind of curve that is right on top of the nail bed, which also has a slightly different color from the pink part, you can also add that in. Right here, I noticed that my pinky is actually a little bit too short, and I decided to erase that and fix that and make it more similar to what I am seeing in the photo there. It wasn't until I got in that end of the previous fingernail in the ring finger next to the pinky that I had that point of comparison and could see that the pinky was a little bit too short. Thankfully, this was easy to fix. So I erased out the entire top of that finger, the entire fingertip. Then I brought out that finger shape a little bit more, making sure that the end of the finger is slightly tapered or a little bit more narrow than the part that is connected to the palm. And once that finger shape was in, I then started adding in the nail with the same steps that I was mentioning previously. Right around here, I'm going to get started with adding in those lines in the palm of the hand. I get started with this line that is coming in from the outer edge of the hand, and because the pinky is covering up a section of that line, I make sure that I restart that line in the middle in a way that it would connect behind the pinky. When you start adding in these lines and even the knuckle lines, bring in line weight variation into your drawing. What I mean by this is consider the lines that you want to make thicker and bolder and the lines that you want to make thinner and lighter. Instead of making all of your line work the same weight, play with that line weight. Consider which lines you want to call the viewer's attention more towards and which lines you want to keep a little bit more subtle and less visible, less stark looking. This is something that we want to also bring in when we're doing our pen and ink work. So with my pencil, in order to make some lines very, very delicate, very thin, very light, I simply make sure that I am barely pressing down at all with my pencil. And whenever I want to make more noticeable, bolder, darker lines, I press down a tiny bit harder. But at no point am I pressing down too hard. I don't want to scratch or damage my paper. And I still want to be able to erase these lines if I need to. I'm observing that reference photo and bringing in the most important, most prominent lines that I have to make sure to add in, and the minor ones I may be not bringing in at all, or if I am, I'm making sure to get them in super lightly or a lot lighter than the most important or the prominent lines. All right, and moving into the fourth and final phase for this hand study, and this one is completely optional. If you've managed to make it to this point, you've already succeeded with this practice, because the main objective for this practice sketch was to achieve believable shapes and proportions for this hand drawing. I just decided to bring in pen and ink to define edges a little bit and kind of finalize the study a little bit more. So before bringing in my pen and ink, what I am doing right here is I am using my kneaded eraser to gently tap over my entire sketch and lighten up my sketch a little bit more, remove any excess graphite that might be floating around on my paper in order to avoid smudging while I'm doing my pen and ink work. Once that has been cleaned up and lightened a little bit more, I am using my 0.3 tip size pigment liner from Staedtler. And the first thing that I am doing here is I am going in and starting to define the edges of my hand, the edges of my fingers, focusing on the outer contours. And you can probably tell that as I am doing this, I am not trying to go in and trace around my entire pencil work around the outer contours of this drawing with one single line, or trying to force myself to create one consistent line all throughout. Instead, by tackling this in sections, I can make sure that I am constantly looking at my reference photo, making sure that I'm incorporating any important curves in these lines, and I'm also able to bring in line weight variation into these outer contours so that my lines are not one same consistent thickness from start to finish. In order to avoid the coloring book or cartoon page kind of look, where you have a very stark, visible, thick outline around everything, which really flattens everything out, by creating these outer contour lines in sections and keeping it moving, I'm avoiding creating stop and start marks, which can definitely be a thing when you're forcing yourself to create very long, consistent lines. And also, you can see how my lines have certain sections which look thicker and darker, and other sections which are mostly the tail end of those lines that I'm creating where I flick my wrist. Those tail ends look thinner and lighter. This creates a way more interesting looking drawing that's more dynamic instead of looking heavy and flat. And it's pretty crazy how much you can describe and how interesting you can make a drawing look by bringing in line weight variation and making intentional use of your line quality. The ink work that I'm doing for this one is really very simple, and I'm not going to be bringing in any shading or adding way too much detail, but it's still a great way to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and practice your pen and ink skills. And it's really a matter of gaining control over your drawing tool, very much like you have to gain control over your drawing pencils. I've created entire live streams on line quality and how to develop better line quality, as well as entire tutorials where I explain different pen and ink shading or mark making techniques, which I'm going to make sure to link to down below in the text section of this tutorial. But as a very brief overview, you want to make sure that you are paying attention to these 4 things as you're working with pen and ink, and noticing how your line quality changes as you're changing these variables. These 4 things are the speed at which you're moving your pen. The second is the angle at which you're using your pen. The third is the pressure that you're exerting on your paper with your pen. And the fourth is, of course, your pen tip size itself. A larger pen tip size is going to lead to a thicker, bolder line, and a smaller pen tip size is going to lead to a thinner, lighter line. And essentially, by paying attention to these 4 variables and shifting and changing the way that you're using your pen, in order to have more of that ink flow down the nib of your pen or less ink flow down the nib of your pen, depending on whether you want thicker, bolder lines or thinner, lighter lines, you're going to be able to arrive at a much more interesting drawing that has dimension and depth to it. When it comes to altering your speed that you're drawing at, if you draw more slowly, more ink is going to be able to flow down the nib of your pen, creating thicker, bolder lines. Whereas if you move quicker, less ink is going to be able to flow down that nib, creating thinner, lighter lines or even broken up lines. When it comes to the angle at which you're using your pen, the more upright or perpendicular the angle that you're using your pen is to the surface of your paper, the more ink is going to flow down, versus if you use your pen at more of a 45-degree angle to your paper or 30-degree angle even, less ink is going to be able to flow down. In terms of the pressure that you're exerting, you don't always want to use the same pressure always. As you're drawing with your pen, you want to alter that pressure as well. The more pressure you exert, the more ink is going to flow down. The less pressure you exert, the less ink is going to flow down, which I would never really recommend pressing down too hard because you can start damaging your paper. But there is still a range that you can use when it comes to that pressure that is going to help you develop that line weight variation. And finally, of course, there is the pen tip size itself. You can choose whether you want to bring in just one single pen tip size like I did right here, or a number of different pen tip sizes. And by changing between them, you're going to also be able to create thicker lines and lighter lines. But if you have gained enough mastery and control over your drawing tool, you will be able to arrive at a great line weight variation even with just one single pen, because you still have those other 3 variables to shift and change between. Alright, so I finished with that initial pen work. I had traced over all of my pencil lines, and once I was done with that, I allowed everything to dry completely, and I then erased out all of my graphite work. Make sure that if you're going to be erasing your pencil work, that you allow all of that ink to completely dry. It should be dry in 5 to 10 minutes. The ink that these pigment liners from Staedtler have dries pretty quickly. I've never had an issue with any smudging or anything like that, but you definitely want to be careful and make sure that your ink is completely dry before you do any erasing. And also, I would say that make sure that your eraser is relatively clean when you go in and do your erasing, because you don't want to dirty things up. But the last thing that I am doing here, after having done that erasing, is I am going over certain lines that I want to make heavier and bolder. This adds depth and dimension to my drawing because I am expanding that line weight variation by making certain lines included in this drawing thicker and bolder. And you can see how this creates a greater variety in the thicknesses of those lines. Notice how I have certain lines that look thinner and lighter, especially crease lines, lines in the wrist, etc. And then other lines that I want to bring forward a little bit more, I made thicker and darker. I would just say that if you are going over certain lines at the end here, be careful not to create feathery or hairy lines. Make sure that you're going over your previous line relatively carefully, but keep it flowing, and try not to do it more than twice, because that is going to increase the possibility of creating hairy looking lines. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.